Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a place and a time where winter didn't just nibble politely at the edges of your comfort. It swallowed you whole. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a Scottish glen, maybe somewhere in the Highlands, maybe in the lowlands near the coast. The day's light has drained away in the blink of an eye, because here in winter, sunset seems to arrive not long after lunch. The air is wet, sharp, and heavy, and as that early dusk settles, you feel the whole countryside being swallowed by 16 long, relentless hours of night. You probably won't survive this without at least 5 blankets, a box bed, and maybe a cow or two breathing beneath the floorboards. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is right now as you listen. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The last rays of a pale northern sun sink below the hills, and the Scottish winter night arrives not gently, not gracefully, but like a door being slammed in your face. The cold rushes forward with no courtesy. In our modern world, night might be a cozy invitation to grab some hot chocolate, scroll through your phone, and let Netflix do the heavy lifting. But here, centuries ago, there was no Netflix. Just stone, wood, and endless dark. 16 hours of it. And unless you prepared carefully during the brief daylight, you'll spend that long night either shivering or regretting the choices you made earlier in the day. Picture yourself as an ordinary Scot in the late medieval period, say the 14th century. The wars with England are simmering on and off like a stubborn pot on a peat fire, but those concerns feel far away for now. Your real battle is with the season itself. The sky turns that particular shade of iron gray that only a northern winter seems to know how to paint, and it's already heavy with cloud threatening snow. You clutch your cloak tighter. It isn't stylish, just thick wool, and heavy enough that it could double as a blanket later tonight. Which, by the way, it will. The cruel part isn't just the cold, though that's bad enough. It's the sheer length of the dark. 16 hours is a long time to keep the fire alive. 16 hours is a long time to keep children quiet and still, to make sure the animals don't freeze, to prevent your own toes from turning into tiny purple lumps of frostbite. Modern heating and electric lights, forget them. This is a fight between human endurance and nature's relentless indifference. Historians still argue whether medieval Scots actually managed to get much real sleep during these nights. Some believe that, like much of Europe, they followed a pattern of segmented sleep. You rest for a few hours, wake around midnight to tend the fire or whisper prayers, then slip back into a second sleep until dawn. Others suggest that in places where the night stretched unnaturally long, the first sleep might drag itself into something like 10 hours, with only short gaps of wakefulness in between. No matter the pattern, what's certain is this: people had to learn how to endure, because the night wasn't going anywhere until well after breakfast time. Now imagine the sensory world of that moment. Outside your cottage, the frost has already locked the grass stiff. You step across the threshold and hear the crunch beneath your boots. Your breath escapes in clouds, white against blackness. There are no street lamps, of course. Your eyes adjust only by the faint glitter of stars when the cloud cover decides to be merciful. More often than not, the sky is overcast, smothering even the moon. Darkness here feels heavier than you'd expect, like someone pressed a wool blanket over the entire landscape. If you're in a village, the silence is broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the groaning hinge of a barn door. If you're further north, maybe up in Caddishness or Sutherland, you can hear the wind barreling in off the sea, hitting the thatched roofs like fists. And somewhere in the wild distance, wolves. Yes, wolves roamed these lands, and their howls at night were not just eerie, they were warnings. You might laugh, tucked up safe in your modern duvet, but back then the sound could quicken your heartbeat. Wolves were known to raid livestock, sometimes even threaten isolated travelers. And nothing ruins a night's sleep faster than worrying whether your sheep will still be alive come dawn. But let's head back inside the cottage. Your family has done what they can to prepare for these long hours. The hearth burns low, fed with peat because firewood is precious and takes too much effort to gather. Peat smoke doesn't rise politely up a chimney. It lingers, seeping into the thatch, soaking into your clothes, clinging to your hair. If you ever wondered why medieval Scots smelled like smoke, this is one reason. The fire is weak light, but it's all you have. You place a rushlight, a sort of makeshift candle made of dried reeds dipped in animal fat, on the table. It burns unevenly, sputtering with a smell that's somewhere between candle wax and fried bacon grease. Not exactly aromatherapy. As the night thickens, the cruel calculation begins. How much peat or wood can you spare? Burn too much too soon and you'll freeze before dawn. Burn too little and the chill creeps in, making sleep impossible. Historians still argue whether people preferred to let the fire die and rely on body heat, or if they considered it essential to keep the flames alive through the entire night. Evidence suggests both strategies, depending on wealth and location. Either way, the fire was not just a convenience, it was survival. Let's pause for a moment to think about how your body feels. You're tired, but not the pleasant kind of tired. It's the weariness that comes from working all daylight hours knowing you'll be awake again in the middle of the night, poking at embers. Your muscles ache from carrying water, chopping wood, or just walking across uneven frozen fields. And here comes the cruel joke. You finally lie down, but the mattress is stuffed with straw that pokes through the fabric. It itches. It smells faintly of mold. Oh, and did I mention the lice? They're there too, sharing the warmth of your blankets like unwelcome roommates. Sleep doesn't arrive with a gentle sigh. It has to be wrestled into being through shivers, through noise, through discomfort. One mainstream historical fact we can be sure of is this. Winters in medieval Scotland were indeed harsher than today's. The period is known as part of the Little Ice Age, a climate era when Europe experienced lower temperatures than usual, with longer, colder winters and shorter growing seasons. This made the nights not only feel colder but also more dangerous, because food supplies were thinner and bodies were weaker from malnutrition. In other words, the dark was doubly cruel because it came when you were least prepared to endure it. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some families placed heated stones at the foot of their beds to keep warm through the night. Yes, they literally took rocks, baked them in the hearth, then wrapped them in cloth before tucking them under the blankets. Think of it as the original electric blanket, except if you wrapped it poorly, you risked scorching your toes. Comforting, isn't it? The night stretches endlessly, and as you lie there, you might begin to notice something odd. The sounds inside your own home. People snore loudly, children toss and whimper, the fire hisses, and above all, the wind sneaks through cracks in the walls. Privacy doesn't exist. If you need to whisper, everyone hears it. If you dream out loud, someone may nudge you awake. These hours aren't just long, they're crowded with the presence of others, even in silence. You close your eyes, trying to surrender to rest, but your mind keeps poking at you. How much longer will the night last? Did you bring the goat in from the byre? Will the roof thatch hold against the storm? These nagging thoughts blur with half-dreams, and before long, you've slipped into the strange liminal state that defines medieval winter nights. Half asleep, half awake, never fully comfortable, never entirely secure. And so the Scottish winter night goes on, stretching and stretching like a shadow with no end. You might catch fragments of sleep, jolted awake when the wind rattles the shutters. You might dream of summer, of long days when the sun doesn't disappear until late evening. But that feels like another universe, another life. Right now, the cruel truth is this: dawn is still many hours away, and the dark has no intention of showing mercy. You shuffle closer to the hearth, rubbing your hands and blowing on your fingers until they stop feeling like icicles. But the fire is only part of the plan. The real strategy for survival during these 16-hour Scottish winter nights is less glamorous and far more crowded. It's called the box bed, and if you thought privacy was a modern luxury, you're about to be reminded just how much you'd miss it. Picture a wooden alcove built right into the wall of your cottage. At first glance, it looks like a wardrobe or maybe a cupboard, except it's meant for people, not clothes. A sliding door, or sometimes just a curtain, shields the interior. Inside is a mattress stuffed with straw, sometimes laid over wooden planks, sometimes right on top of rope netting. That's your bed. And not just yours, your parents, siblings, maybe even a grandparent or two, all squeezed in together. Think of it as a medieval bunk, except with zero personal space and a smell you won't forget in a hurry. Historians still argue whether this arrangement was purely for warmth or also for safety. Some suggest it was about conserving heat, since human bodies generate more warmth when pressed together. Others believe it was about hiding from drafts, since a box bed with a curtain kept the worst of the icy air away. Either way, the effect was the same. You learned to sleep cheek to jowl with your family. Hopping, the combined warmth outweighed the discomfort of an elbow in your ribs. The cruelty of these nights wasn't just the cold, it was the lack of choice. Today, if your sibling snores like a tractor or hogs the blankets, you can storm off to another room. In medieval Scotland, there was no other room. The cottage was a single space. Hearth, table, animals below, box beds tucked against the wall. You slept where you were told, or you didn't sleep at all. Now let's be honest. Sometimes this closeness was comforting. You might drift off with the familiar rhythm of your mother's breathing beside you, or the soft weight of your little brother's hand clutching your sleeve. But other times, not so charming. Someone turns over and the whole bed shifts. Someone coughs and you all wake up. And let's not forget the straw mattress itself. It rustles, itches, and occasionally wiggles with tiny creatures that weren't invited. You wouldn't exactly write glowing Yelp reviews about this place. Here's a mainstream fact. Box beds were widespread in Scotland from the medieval period all the way through the 18th and 19th centuries. They became almost iconic in Highland homes. Archaeological and written evidence shows they were considered practical, durable, and even cozy, at least by the standards of the time. But modern visitors who see surviving examples often react with a mix of fascination and horror. The idea of crawling into a wooden cupboard with your entire family is just not the sort of thing we brag about on airborne listings. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some box beds had little shelves built inside them, where families kept rosary beads, charms, or even small images of saints. Imagine lying down to sleep with a shelf hovering inches above your head, stocked with protective talismans in case the night turned unfriendly. A medieval security system, if you will, except instead of alarms it was holy symbols and the occasional sprig of rowan wood. The heat of bodies trapped in that wooden alcove did its job, but it also had consequences. The air got stuffy, damp with breath, and heavy with the smell of wool, sweat, and peat smoke clinging to clothes. And if you think modern people complain about lack of fresh air in bedrooms, imagine being in a wooden box with 5 other humans and no ventilation. Still, you pulled the curtain closed because the icy draft outside was even worse. What does this say about daily life? It tells us that comfort, as we understand it, wasn't the goal. Survival was the only metric that mattered. 16 hours of cold, creeping dark meant you did what worked, even if it was cramped and itchy. Privacy was a foreign concept. The Scottish winter didn't care about your personal space. It only cared whether you had enough warmth to last until dawn. And let's add one more layer of cruelty. If you happen to live in a larger household, maybe with servants or extended kin, the box beds filled quickly. Overflowing bodies meant some slept on benches, others directly on the floor with only a blanket of sheepskin. That wasn't a punishment, it was just logistics. Somebody had to draw the short straw, and hopefully it wasn't literal straw scattered on stone. Historians still argue whether children were always tucked into the box beds with their parents or sometimes placed separately. Some evidence suggests that infants often slept in cradles near the fire instead, swaddled tight against the cold. But the older you got, the more likely you were to squeeze into that communal space. Think of it as the Scottish version of graduating into the adult bed, except there were no parties or diplomas, just less legroom. If we zoom out for a moment, there's something quietly fascinating about this arrangement. In our modern culture, sleep is seen as personal, even sacred. We buy custom mattresses, argue about memory foam versus springs, and sometimes even buy fancy machines that simulate ocean waves so we can doze in peace. In medieval Scotland, sleep was collective. You gave up comfort to stay alive. Your body wasn't yours alone. It was part of a small ecosystem of warmth and survival. And just imagine the dreams in that bed. 5 people breathing in unison, sometimes muttering in their sleep, their subconscious minds all colliding in the stale air. Someone might dream of angels, another of wolves, another of a warm summer meadow. And if one cried out suddenly, the others jolted awake, hearts hammering, waiting for the fear to pass. 16 hours of this, drifting, waking, turning, pressing closer, shifting apart. The night was long, but you endured it together. So you curl into your corner of the box bed, knees pressed to chest, A sibling's foot poking at your back, and you tell yourself dawn will come eventually. But not soon. Not yet. For now, you close your eyes and accept that the cruelest truth of a Scottish winter night is that you must share it, whether you want to or not. You shift in the box bed, nudged awake by someone's elbow, and you realize it isn't just human company keeping you from restful slumber. Beneath the floorboards, below the very planks of your cottage, there's an orchestra of grunts, shuffles, and snorts. Because in medieval Scotland, when winter nights dragged on for 16 hours, the animals weren't left outside to fend for themselves. They came in with you. Well, not into your bed, thankfully, but close enough. This wasn't a matter of affection, like keeping a dog at the foot of your bed in modern times. It was survival, plain and simple. The family cow, a few goats, maybe a sheep or two. These weren't just walking larders or milk producers. They were heaters. Their bodies, constantly radiating warmth, became an extension of the household's fragile defense against frost. You could almost call them furry furnaces, except instead of quiet humming, they came with the soundtrack of constant digestive activity. Historians still argue whether this practice was universal across Scotland or more common in certain regions. In the Highlands, with harsher winds and poorer housing, it seems almost certain. In the Lowlands, where larger farmsteads had separate barns, maybe less so. But archaeological studies of blockhouses, those long, low highland dwellings, confirm that people and animals lived under one roof, often separated only by a low partition. Imagine the smell, the warmth, and the noise, all bundled together into your 16-hour night. The practical side was undeniable. A single cow could produce as much warmth as a small fire. Goats and sheep added their share too. When the wind howled through the cracks of stone walls and thatched roofs, when frost clung to windows so thick you couldn't scrape it clear, the combined heat of animals helped keep the living space survivable. Without them, the night might literally have been lethal. But let's not romanticize it too much. Sharing your nights with livestock wasn't cozy. The animals shifted constantly, hooves scraping, tails swatting. You might just be drifting back into that uneasy half-sleep when a goat lets out a sharp bleat that jolts you awake. Or the cow coughs. Yes, cows cough, and loudly. And you wonder if it's sick, which would be catastrophic for the family. And then there's the smell. We won't go into graphic detail, but suffice it to say, manure doesn't take 16 hours off just because the sun's gone down. Here's one mainstream fact worth holding onto. The design of Highland blockhouses deliberately placed animals at one end and humans at the other, with the central hearth between them. The smoke from the peat fire filled the house, drifting upward through the thatch instead of a chimney. That smoke, while choking by modern standards, also helped disinfect and dry the air a little, masking some of the animal stench. Quirky, isn't it? The same smoke that made your lungs ache was also the thing that kept disease from spreading too quickly. And for a fringe tidbit, some sources suggest people even believed sleeping above animals had spiritual benefits, as if the creature's warmth carried protective energy against evil spirits. Whether that was faith, folklore, or just wishful thinking, it shows how deeply interwoven humans and beasts were in the medieval Scottish night. Still, it's worth noting that historians continue to debate the psychological side of this arrangement. Did medieval Scots become so accustomed to animal noise that they hardly noticed it anymore? Or did it constantly disturb their fragile rest? Accounts from later centuries suggest both possibilities. One visitor to the highlands in the 17th century remarked that the mingling of man and beast seemed brutish and impossible for a refined person to endure. Yet for the locals, it was ordinary, even necessary. Maybe it's like living next to a railway line. You stop hearing the trains after a while. Now imagine yourself lying there in the box bed. The fire is low, the curtain pulled tight, but you can still hear the muffled chewing of the cow below grinding endlessly at the cud. The goats shuffle, hooves clacking against stone. Occasionally the animals snort, a wet, sudden sound that makes you flinch. And then silence for a few blessed minutes. You close your eyes, drift towards sleep until the cow decides it's time to shift its weight, and the whole floor creaks with the movement. This was the nightly rhythm, human restlessness above, animal restlessness below. It blurred the boundary between household and barn, reminding you that your survival was tied directly to these creatures. They gave milk, wool, and eventually meat. But on long winter nights, their gift was warmth. You depended on them, and in some strange way, they depended on you too. Of course, this closeness had risks. Disease could spread from livestock to humans more easily in such cramped conditions. Respiratory illnesses, parasites, even fleas found it easier to cross the invisible boundary when man and beast lived under one roof. But in a world where freezing to death was a bigger immediate threat than catching a cough, the risk was worth taking. And so the Scottish night dragged on, thick with animal sounds, with warmth mingled with smell, with comfort intertwined with discomfort. You turned on your side, pressing closer to your family in the box bed, but you couldn't quite escape the awareness that your bed was just one part of a layered living organism. People, animals, fire, and stone, all poolsing together in defiance of the cold. In that sense, winter nights weren't just long, they were shared. Shared with kin, shared with livestock, shared with the uninvited pests that came with both. It was survival by community, a community that stretched beyond humans to every living body capable of producing heat. And as you finally begin to slip into the shallow pools of sleep, you're reminded once more, in medieval Scotland, comfort was never the point. Endurance was. The hours crawl forward. You've dozed a little, stirred awake by the cow below, then drifted back under the heavy breath of family pressed into the box bed. But soon enough, you feel the night tightening its grip again. The cold begins seeping in through every seam and crack. It slides over the wooden boards, whispers across your skin, and reminds you with a cruel, sharp nip. Without the hearth, none of you will last until dawn. The fire is life. It's not metaphorical, it is literal survival. The embers glow faintly in the center of the cottage, a little pile of orange breathing among gray ash. But it needs tending. It always needs tending. Someone must rise from the semi-warmth of the bed, tiptoe across the frigid floor and coax those embers back into flame. Maybe tonight it's you. You crouch down, blowing gently. Sparks leap and scatter like tiny fireflies. You place a dried twig onto the coals, then another, nursing the heat upward. But here's the cruel calculation of a Scottish winter. How much fuel do you really have? Firewood is scarce. Forests in Scotland were already heavily diminished by the late Middle Ages. The Highlands in particular offered more bog than woodland, and what trees grew there were jealously guarded or quickly chopped. For most families, keeping a fire fueled with proper wood through a 16-hour night simply wasn't possible. Instead, the hearth burns peat. If you've never met peat before, let me paint the picture. It's partially decayed vegetation dug out of bogs, cut into bricks, and left to dry. Once dried, you stack it, carry it home, and hope it lasts the winter. When it burns, peat doesn't roar with cheerful flames like oak or pine, it smolders. It gives off a low, steady heat, perfect for slow survival but frustratingly smoky. And that smoke, it doesn't politely exit through a chimney, because in many cottages there isn't one. It drifts up, filling the rafters, seeping into the thatch, and hanging in the air until your eyes sting and your lungs ache. Historians still argue whether medieval Scots were more resilient to smoke or simply resigned to it. Some suggest their bodies adapted. Others point to high rates of respiratory illness. Either way, you didn't really have a choice. You breathed smoke every night, and you accepted that the smell of burning peat would cling to your clothes, your hair, even your dreams. The hearth flickers, casting long shadows on the stone walls. It becomes more than just heat. It's a fragile kind of companionship in the dark. Without it, the room would be swallowed whole by blackness, and the cold would gnaw through the box bed curtains within an hour. With it, there's at least the illusion of security, though the fire itself is treacherous. Let it die and you freeze. Let it flare too high and you risk a spark catching in the thatch overhead. More than one cottage burned down not because of invaders or lightning, but because someone fell asleep with the fire untended. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval Scots sometimes tossed dried seaweed onto the fire when peat ran low. Seaweed burns with a peculiar smell, sharp and salty, and while it didn't provide long-lasting heat, it gave just enough to stretch out the embers until morning. So if you're wondering what medieval Scotland smelled like on a winter night, imagine a stew of peat smoke, animal musk, unwashed wool, and the occasional burst of burning seaweed. Not exactly a scented candle. The work of fueling the hearth wasn't evenly shared either. Often it fell to women or older children to keep the fire alive while others dozed. There's evidence that some households treated the hearth as sacred. Symbols of protection were carved nearby, or charms hung to guard against spirits that might creep in with the smoke. After all, in the medieval imagination, fire was not just physical but spiritual. It warded off both frost and the unseen. But even with constant tending, there was never enough fuel to burn brightly all night. Fires were kept low, a mere glow of orange that barely lit the room, and so your night vision sharpened. You learned to move by memory, step around the stool, duck under the hanging cloak, shuffle back to the bed without stubbing your toe. 16 hours of half-light shaped the rhythm of your body. Let's add one more scholarly debate to the mix. Historians still argue whether people went to bed as soon as the sun set in winter, or whether they stretched the evening with tasks done by firelight. Some argue the long darkness was used for spinning wool, mending tools, or quietly telling stories around the hearth. Others suggest the exhaustion of daily work meant most people surrendered to bed early, letting the fire die to embers. Maybe both were true, depending on the family. What's clear is that the fire dictated the schedule more than the clock. When it burned, you could function. When it faded, you had no choice but to sleep. Now think about what this does to your body. The air is thick with smoke. Your chest feels heavy, your eyes water, and yet you press closer to the glow. Your fingers ache from cold whenever you leave the hearth's circle. You're tired, desperately tired, but the fear of waking to a dead fire keeps you tethered. Each hour is a gamble. Feed the flames now and risk running out of fuel later, or let it fade and risk a frost that no amount of huddling can fight. It's cruel, isn't it? The very thing keeping you alive is also the thing making you cough. The warmth is always temporary, always precarious, and always too little. You shuffle back to the box bed, the fire whispering weakly behind you, and you know you'll be back again in another few hours. 16 hours of night means 16 hours of battle with the hearth, a battle you must win again and again, until at last dawn breaks. You've managed to stir the embers back to a faint glow, enough to hold off the creeping chill for another hour. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even with a fire burning, you never really feel warm. Not in the deep winter of medieval Scotland. The cold has a way of sliding under doors, slithering through cracks in stone walls, and settling into your bones like a permanent tenant. You can layer yourself in fabric until you resemble a lumpy barrel, and still the frost kisses your skin. So you start dressing for survival, not comfort. Tonight, as on every other night of winter, you pile on everything you own. You tug rough woolen hose over your legs, the fabric so scratchy you swear it's designed to make you itch rather than insulate. You wrap a heavy plaid around your shoulders, woven in the dark greens and browns of the land, not because it's fashionable, though centuries later it will be romanticized as tartan, but because it's thick enough to trap some warmth. If you're lucky, you might have a fur pelt draped across your lap, deer or rabbit, still carrying the faint musk of the animal it once was. It's not just you. Every member of the household is swaddled in layers of wool and skins. Children wear hand-me-downs so patched and darned that the original fabric is barely visible beneath the stitches. Bobbies are wrapped in swaddling cloths that smell of smoke and lanolin. Your elders pull their cloaks tight, their breath puffing in the dark, and mutter about winters harsher than this one, a claim made every year, whether true or not. Mainstream history tells us that wool was Scotland's lifeblood. The economy itself leaned heavily on sheep, with wool being one of the few exports valuable enough to trade. Which means you're surrounded by the stuff spun, woven, layered over your body. And yet here's the irony. Wool insulates wonderfully when dry, but in Scotland dry is a word that appears in dreams, not daily life. The air is damp, the ground is damp, your very bed is damp. Wool that's perpetually moist loses much of its magic. So yes, you're wearing wool, but it's the clammy kind, clinging to your skin like a cold sponge. Now let me slip in a quirky tidbit. Some medieval Scots actually slept wearing their outdoor cloaks, the same heavy garment they'd wear herding animals or trudging through bogs. These cloaks doubled as bedding, rain shields, and blankets. Think of them as the original all-purpose camping gear. They weren't washed often. Wool doesn't take kindly to a good scrubbing, so they carried the permanent scent of smoke, sweat, and whatever the last storm left behind. Picture crawling into bed each night not with fresh pajamas, but with something that smells like you rolled down a wet hillside. Charming, isn't it? As the long night drags on, you adjust your layers again and again. The plaid slips off your shoulder, the fur slides to the floor, your hose bunch at the knee. No matter how much you wrap, some patch of exposed skin finds the cold and complains. Toes are the worst. They ache, they go numb. And if the night is particularly merciless, you might wake to frostbite nipping at them. Historians still argue whether frostbite was common among the rural poor or exaggerated in later tales. The lack of medical records makes it hard to pin down, but you know from experience, when your toes burn with cold, it's not just a story. The layering of clothes also changes how you sleep. You don't stretch out like in a modern bed. You curl tight, knees drawn to chest, minimizing the surface area that cold air can touch. Your family mirrors you, curled like commas in the box bed. At times it feels less like resting and more like survival hibernation. You wonder if bears have it easier. At least they get to sleep uninterrupted. Clothing, of course, wasn't equal across classes. The wealthy in castles had access to imported furs, fox, sable, even ermine if you were lucky enough to hover near royalty. But for the average crofter, it was whatever could be trapped, traded, or sheared nearby. That means your winter wardrobe is a patchwork of local possibility. Rabbit skin with thin spots where the fur wore off. A deer hide that stiffens and cracks because it wasn't tanned properly. Sometimes you use animal skin, not as clothing but as bedding, laying it on the straw mattress to add one more thin barrier between you and the cold ground. Yet despite all these layers, there's still that moment every single night when you feel the chill sneaking in. It comes from the floorboards, or perhaps from the air venting through the smoke hole above. It snakes up your legs and reminds you that Scotland's winter darkness is not just long but cruel. You shift, mutter, tug the plaid higher, and pretend you're warm enough. And here's a small joke to keep you awake a little longer. Medieval layering was less about fashion and more about becoming a wool-stuffed onion. Peel away one layer and there's just another scratchy one beneath it. In fact, you probably spent more time removing your clothing in summer than putting it on in winter. But you don't think about summer tonight. Summer feels like a fable someone told you once, a story from a far-off land. So you curl back into the bed, all wrapped and swaddled, your breath dampening the wool near your face. You wait for the next hour to pass, for the fire to need tending again, and you wonder, how many layers would it take to finally beat this cold? You suspect the answer is more than you'll ever have. The fire has burned low again, and your layers of wool and fur are barely holding back the chill. But there's another source of warmth in your home tonight, not from cloth or flame, but from bodies, and not just human ones. Because in medieval Scotland, you don't get the luxury of a house designed for privacy. You get a single-room dwelling, maybe with a loft or a box bed tucked into the wall, but otherwise it's all open space. And when the nights stretch to 16 hours of bitter darkness, you bring every possible heat source inside. That means your animals come too. Yes, that scratching at the corner. That's your chickens, restless and fluttering, feathers shedding onto the dirt floor. That bleating sound behind you. A goat, tethered near the door so it doesn't chew its way through your plaid while you sleep. And that low, heavy sigh in the shadows. That's the family cow, shifting its bulk, its warm breath steaming in the frigid air. It sounds odd to modern ears, who would want to share their bedroom with livestock. But in this world, it's perfectly practical. Chickens mean eggs in the morning, Goats mean milk. A cow is worth more than gold to a household scraping by. If you leave them outside in the howling winds, they might freeze or be stolen. Inside, at least, they survive. And as a bonus, their body heat radiates into the room, raising the temperature by a degree or two. In the dead of winter, a degree is a gift. Mainstream history confirms this arrangement. Archaeological digs in Scotland have revealed the remains of byre houses, long dwellings where people lived on one side and animals were kept on the other, separated only by a low partition. Sometimes there wasn't even a partition at all. Your bed might be no more than 10 feet from the family cow. In the darkness, you don't just share a home, you share a habitat. But here's a quirky tidbit. Animals inside meant not just warmth, but danger. Chickens could roost in rafters, and more than one medieval family woke to find droppings sprinkled across their sleeping heads. Goats, notorious for chewing anything, might gnaw on the wool of your cloak as you snore. And cows? Well, cows don't stop producing waste just because you're trying to get some shut-eye. Imagine drifting off to sleep only to hear the unmistakable splash of a fresh deposit on the earthen floor. Cozy, right? Still, you adjust. The clucking becomes background noise, a lullaby of sorts. The smell, ripe, musky, and layered with hay, dung, and smoke, becomes so familiar that you stop noticing it. In fact, when you do step outside, the clean, cold air stings your nose like it's too sharp, too empty. Inside the house, foul though it may be, is home. Of course, animals bring risks as well as warmth. They carry fleas and lice, which jump from fur to skin to bedding. They attract predators too. Wolves, in the early medieval centuries, still roamed parts of Scotland, their howls occasionally drifting through the night. Keeping the animals close means you hear their alarm if danger comes. But it also means that if wolves or thieves decide to attack, they're coming straight to your front door. Historians still argue whether wolves posed a serious danger to people, or if they mostly targeted livestock. But when you hear that howl echoing, you don't stop to debate. You just clutch your plaid tighter and hope your fire keeps burning. Now imagine the sounds layered together. The crackle of fatting embers, the soft wheeze of your father's snore, the constant shifting of the cow's hooves, the rustle of chickens settling their wings. Sleep in this world isn't silent. It's a noisy chorus of survival. And yet somehow it soothes you. The animal's presence, chaotic though it is, reassures you that you're not alone in the dark. But here comes the gentle sarcasm. Sure, you have warmth, but you've also basically turned your house into a petting zoo without the pet part. Every animal here is a tool, an investment, a walking meal ticket. There's no cuddling with goats for fun, no indemonstrable cow selfies. You keep them alive because they keep you alive. The relationship is practical, not sentimental. And still, in the dead of night, you sometimes catch yourself listening to their steady breathing and thinking, maybe this is the closest thing to comfort I'll ever have. The social order doesn't end just because it's bedtime. Children are tasked with keeping chickens calm. Older boys might check the door latch to be sure the goat doesn't wander out. Mothers keep a sharp ear for coughing, because if your cow catches a chill and dies, your family's survival is suddenly in jeopardy. The animals aren't just guests. They're family members in a hierarchy that no one dares question. So you lie there, cocooned in wool, surrounded by fur and feathers, lulled by the clamor of creatures that shouldn't belong in a bedroom but absolutely do. It's messy, smelly, noisy, and sometimes even dangerous. But it's also the only reason you don't freeze to death before the long Scottish night gives way to dawn. You wake with a start. Maybe it was the crack of the fire collapsing into ash, or the cow shifting its weight in the corner. But in your mind, it's something else entirely. Because in medieval Scotland, when darkness lasts 16 hours, every sound is suspicious, every shadow alive, every creak a message from something you can't see. Superstition isn't a side note in your life, it's a guiding principle. You live in a world where people believe the unseen is always watching. Spirits slip through cracks in the walls. Fairies wait at thresholds. Witches lurk in the folds of the night. And here you are, a child or a weary adult, lying in near darkness, listening as the long hours of midnight stretch out, convinced that you are not alone. The mainstream historical fact is simple. Belief in the supernatural was woven into daily Scottish life during the Middle Ages. Chroniclers record fears of restless souls, charms against fairies, and prayers to ward off witches. The Kirk later condemned these practices, but they were too deep to erase overnight. In the long winters when night lingered, superstition was a survival strategy. You carried iron charms, whispered blessings, and drew protective symbols, anything to keep away what lurked beyond the firelight. And here's your quirky tidbit. People didn't just worry about what might enter their homes, they worried about what might leave them. Folklore warned that fairies could steal your soul while you slept, whisking you away to their realm and leaving a sickly changeling in your place. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, checking on your baby sibling and wondering, is that really him or has he been swapped? It's not the kind of thought that helps you drift back to sleep. Historians still argue whether people truly believed in literal fairies, or if these stories functioned as metaphors for illness, deformity, or sudden infant death. But for you, in the darkness of a drafty cottage, there's no debate. The fairies are real enough, and you make sure to spit 3 times before bed, because that's supposed to keep them at bay. The fire throws flickering shapes across the walls. In your half-dreaming state, those shapes become figures. A long arm stretches toward the bed. A face forms in the corner, teeth glinting. Your rational mind tells you it's just smoke and shadow, but rational isn't much comfort in the 14th century. You clutch the plaid tighter around you, maybe murmur a quick pater noster, maybe press your thumb against a cross carved into the bed frame, just in case. And let's be honest, it's not only children who are afraid. Grown men, warriors even, whisper charms before sleep. A farmer places a sprig of rowan wood over the door. A mother sprinkles holy water near the bed. Night doesn't care if you're brave or skeptical. In the endless hours of darkness, everyone is vulnerable. You start to notice how superstition governs bedtime routines. Doors must be shut with a prayer. Shoes, if you own them, are never left upside down. Bad luck, they say. Knives are hidden beneath pillows to ward off nightmares. And if you dream of a black dog, you wake trembling, sure that death is coming. Here comes the sarcastic aside. Ah, yes, nothing says sweet dreams like the thought that invisible fairies might drag you from your bed and replace you with a look-alike imposter. You thought your insomnia was bad. Try medieval Scotland, where restless nights are practically baked into the culture. Still, there's a strange comfort in these rituals. Fear is frightening, yes, but it's also communal. Everyone believes together. Everyone tells the same stories, repeats the same charms. The act of muttering protection spells isn't just magical insurance. It's a way to convince yourself you've done something, however small, to control the uncontrollable. And in the long silence between midnight and dawn, that illusion of control is often the only thing that keeps you sane. The night is heavy, thick, and silent, at least in your crofter's cottage. But a few miles away, inside stone walls colder than your own, something stirs. The monastery bells ring out, their echoes rolling across the blackened hills like the groaning of some iron beast. You jolt awake, not because the sound reaches your ears, though sometimes it does, but because you sense the rhythm of it, the breaking of silence that signals the monks have risen. For the Benedictines, the Augustinians, or the Cistercians scattered across medieval Scotland, sleep is never a continuous, indulgent 8 hours. Their lives are ruled by the canonical hours, 7 sacred breaks in the day, each demanding prayer, chant, or reading. And one of the most punishing of these comes deep in the night, matins. While you toss under a blanket of scratchy wool, monks pull themselves from thin straw pallets, shiver in damp cloisters, and shuffle toward the chapel by candlelight. Here's your mainstream fact. Monastic rules demanded that the day be punctuated with prayer, no matter the hour. The night office, matins, usually fell at midnight or just after, and it required the entire community to gather and chant psalms in unison. The purpose was clear: to sanctify even the darkest hours, to remind themselves that God never sleeps. But imagine the reality. You're barefoot on icy flagstones. Your robe is thin, heavy with the moisture that seeps into stone walls in the Scottish winter. Your stomach growls because dinner was a piece of bread, a ladle of pottage, and maybe a cup of ale. You chant psalms until your throat aches, the words bouncing in Latin against the chapel's vaulted stone. The candle sputters. Your mind drifts. You wonder quietly if even God might prefer to wait until dawn. And here's the quirky tidbit. Monks had their own secret hacks for surviving these midnight vigils. Chroniclers mention them pinching themselves awake, dipping their hands in icy water, or even leaning against the choir stalls so they wouldn't collapse mid-prayer. Sometimes, novices were tasked with watching the older brethren and giving them a discreet nudge if they started to nod off. Imagine your entire job being medieval holy alarm clock. Historians still argue whether monks truly kept to this rigid schedule or whether, in smaller priories, the rules bent a little. Did every Scottish monastery really drag everyone out at midnight in January when the wind howled like a banshee? Or did some quietly move prayers closer to dawn, adjusting for human frailty? The records suggest both, rigid in theory, flexible in practice, which, let's be honest, is how most of us handle any New Year's resolution. From your perspective, lying in your cottage bed, the monastery bell is a kind of ghostly reassurance. Somewhere, someone is awake, watching, chanting. It's like an eternal nightlight across the hills. But at the same time, it's unsettling. Imagine knowing that while you're supposed to be safe in first sleep, a group of men are marching barefoot across flagstones, muttering words in a language you don't understand, summoning God's presence in the cold. It adds another layer to the supernatural feel of the night. If the monks are awake, maybe it's because the veil between worlds really is thinner. Maybe prayers are needed to hold back the dark. Maybe they're awake to fight off demons that ordinary folk can't see. When the bell tolls, you pull your blanket tighter and whisper your own half-remembered prayer, not sure if you're joining them or protecting yourself. Here's a cheeky modern aside. Think about this next time you groan about your phone buzzing at 3 a.m. At least your midnight vigil is scrolling TikTok under the covers, not chanting psalms barefoot while frost climbs the walls. The monastery shapes the rhythm of night not only for the monks but for the wider community. Bells announce time, and in a world without clocks, the tolling becomes a heartbeat. Even in sleep, you orient yourself by it. That must be midnight, that must be dawn. And so the monks, weary as they are, become guardians of time itself. The chant fades back into silence. The monks shuffle back to their pallets, some collapsing immediately into second sleep, others lingering with scripture. Across the fields, you too slide back into dreams, comforted or haunted by the knowledge that the night belongs not only to beasts and spirits, but also to men who refuse to let it pass unmarked. Your bed creaks beneath you as you shift for warmth, but sleep never feels safe. Outside, the black of night presses in like a physical weight. You know you should rest. You've been laboring all day in frozen fields, but your ears stay tuned to every sound. A snapping twig, the low bark of a dog, the distant roll of hooves. You live in a Scotland where the clan feud is never far away. For centuries, families nursed grudges that flared into sudden violence, not in broad daylight but often in the cover of night. You can almost imagine it. A rival clan riding silently up a glen, their torches unlit, swords strapped at their sides. Sleep is not indulgence, it's a gamble. Here's the historical fact. The highlands and borders were rife with violence through the medieval period. Clan feuds could last generations, with entire valleys living under the shadow of revenge. At night, raids were common, both because darkness gave cover and because it sowed maximum terror. You never knew when your neighbor or your enemy's cousin 3 valleys away might decide tonight was the night to settle accounts. And so, even in your bed, you don't lie still. A dirk might be stashed beneath the blanket. A bow hangs on the wall within reach. Some households even kept a lookout by night, posted on a hilltop or tower, ready to rouse the family with the blow of a horn. That's not paranoia, it's survival. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Some Highlanders slept with their weapons literally tucked into their bedding. Imagine rolling over in the middle of the night and realizing you've spooned a broadsword. Not exactly the cuddliest bedtime companion. Still, a blade close at hand offered more comfort than a woolen pillow ever could. Historians still argue whether these raids were as constant and widespread as later stories claim. Were medieval Scots really enduring sleepless nights in fear of enemies at the door, or have chroniclers exaggerated, painting Scotland as eternally savage and restless? It's possible that the reality varied wildly, peaceful years punctuated by sudden bursts of bloodshed. But in memory and folklore, it all blends into one long, anxious vigil. Picture this. You're half asleep when a banging rattles the shutters. Is it the wind? A wolf? Or worse, raiders come to set fire to your thatch. Families often slept in their clothes during turbulent seasons, boots by the bed, ready to flee at a moment's notice. You don't want to waste precious seconds fumbling with laces if the roof above your head is about to ignite. Let's pull a modern aside. Ever sleep badly before an early flight, convinced your alarm won't go off? Now multiply that by 1,000. Add the possibility of someone charging into your bedroom with a claymore, and you've got medieval Scottish bedtime anxiety. The borderlands tell their own story. Down south, the Anglo-Scottish frontier was a kind of permanent war zone. Border rivers, raiders on horseback would sweep into villages in the dead of night, stealing cattle, burning barns, and vanishing before sunrise. Entire families were trained to be light sleepers, because if you weren't, you could wake up with nothing, or not wake up at all. Even when there wasn't a raid, the fear of one rewired how you experienced night. You don't drift into deep slumber. You hover in half-sleep, ears pricked for danger. Dreams blur with reality. Sometimes you wake convinced you heard a scream, only to find it was just an owl. Other times you ignore the owl call, only to find too late that men are already at your gate. And of course, whispers of the supernatural tangle with these fears. Was that rider on the hill a rival clan scout, or the phantom horseman said to haunt your valley? You don't always know, and maybe you don't want to. Either way, you grip your weapon tighter. Yet somehow, through all of this, life continues. You still work, laugh, gossip, eat. You still climb under scratchy blankets every night. You just do it with one eye open and a dagger pressed against your thigh. It's not just the cold that keeps you from drifting into blissful unconsciousness. It's the knowledge that darkness isn't empty. It's full of men who might, at any moment, decide your sleep is over. You shift in your bed, but tonight it isn't the fear of raiders or the howling wind that keeps you from drifting off. It's the growl in your stomach. Hunger gnaws like a parasite, sharper than the cold, sharper even than the edge of a blade. Your belly is empty, and no position makes it easier to forget. Medieval Scotland was no stranger to famine. Crops failed often, sometimes from relentless rain that drowned the fields, other times from frost that arrived too early, or sometimes from sheer neglect when wars tore men away from plows. When food was scarce, sleep became cruel. Your body craved rest, but your gut twisted and demanded attention. You can't ignore the ache. It follows you under the blankets, lingers in your dreams, and startles you awake. Here's the historical fact. Scotland's famines were frequent, recorded throughout the Middle Ages, with particularly devastating years in the 14th and 15th centuries. Chroniclers noted entire villages struggling to survive winters when grain stores had run out months before spring planting. Sleep wasn't restful then. It was an exercise in conserving energy, a desperate attempt to stretch what little fuel remained in your body. And hunger played strange tricks. Some people swore that starving sleepers dreamed constantly of feasts, tables groaning with bread, wheels of cheese, steaming meat pies. You close your eyes, and in your dream you reach for a roast goose, only to wake with your fist clenched around nothing, your mouth dry, your gut hollow. Sleep becomes a torment. Now add sickness. The medieval night could carry whispers of plague. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept into Scotland, trailing from England northward. Imagine lying in a wooden box bed with your family pressed close for warmth and someone coughs. Just one cough, deep and rattling. You turn in your bed, wide awake, because you know what it might mean. Fever doesn't sleep. The sick tossed and moaned through the long hours, sweat soaking rough linen sheets. Families sat awake in the dark, listening for the ragged breathing of a loved one. Sometimes they prayed for healing, other times they prayed only for the suffering to end quickly. And if death came in the night, the survivors found themselves awake in the darkness, whispering prayers over a still body until dawn. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some households, onions were hung by the bed as a supposed protection against plague. You're lying there in a cramped bed, coughing fits rattling the walls, and above your head dangles a string of onions like the world's least appetizing dream catcher. Did it work? No. Did it make people feel like they were doing something? Yes. Historians still argue whether plague hit Scotland as hard as it did England. Records are scattered, and some suggest the country's scattered population might have blunted the worst of the spread. Others argue outbreaks were just as horrific but less well recorded. Either way, fear was real enough to keep entire households staring into the dark long after the fire died. But whether it was famine or plague, the result was the same. Sleep lost its innocence. You didn't fall into bed thinking only of warmth and dreams. You fell into bed wondering if you'd wake hungry, wake sick, or wake at all. And here's the strangest part. Some families during famine years deliberately shortened their sleep. The less time you spent lying awake with an empty belly, the less maddening the hunger became. They'd force themselves to get up at night, walk outside, tend the fire, anything to distract the mind. You too might stumble into the black night, look up at the stars, and wonder how many more nights like this you could endure. So tonight, when your own stomach grumbles because you skipped a midnight snack, remember that centuries ago, a Scot lay awake under the same sky, hearing the same growl, but with no hope of relief. In the medieval night, sleep was supposed to be an escape, but famine and plague broke that promise. Darkness stretched on, and rest became as scarce as bread. You'd think sleep would be one of the few luxuries the nobility had over common folk. After all, lords and ladies lived in castles, stone walls, carved beds, feather mattresses, embroidered coverlets. Surely their nights were restful compared to the peasants who curled up on straw in smoky cottages, right? Well, not quite. Darkness is the great equalizer, and medieval Scotland's nights were long enough to humble everyone, from shepherds to kings. In truth, both noble and peasant carried their burdens into bed, though in different shapes and sizes. If you were a peasant, your sleeping place was rough, smoky, and cramped. You might lie on a sack of straw that smelled faintly of mold, covered by a coarse wool blanket, your entire family jammed into the same space. The only warmth came from the peat fire that filled your lungs with smoke as much as it heated the room. Sleep was broken, restless, a negotiation with discomfort. But if you were noble, tucked into a carved four-poster bed, things weren't as cozy as the paintings suggest. The castle walls might be grand, but they were cold, damp, and drafts. Wind slipped through the arrow slits and froze your toes no matter how many blankets you piled on. And castles echoed. Every creak, every servant's step, Every moan of the wind in the courtyard carried straight into your chamber. You might close your eyes, but silence never followed. Here's the historical fact. Medieval Scottish castles were notorious for their chill. Archaeological studies of castle architecture show they were designed more for defense than comfort. Thick stone walls stored cold, and fireplaces, though imposing, often failed to heat the vast chambers. It wasn't unusual for frost to form on the inside of a window even while nobles lay in feather beds. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some noble families slept sitting upright, propped on pillows. They believed lying flat encouraged disease, or worse, suffocation by evil spirits. So imagine yourself, lord of the manor, spending the long winter night half reclined, your neck cricked, trying not to slide down in your sleep. Luxury, yes, but comfort, questionable. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually slept worse than nobles. On one hand, peasants had less bedding, less warmth, and more crowding. On the other, their smaller cottages might have been easier to heat than cavernous stone halls, and their sleep patterns, two-part slumber, close family bonds, may have given them a sense of intimacy the nobility lacked. But here, where the divide grows clearer, nobles often shared their sleeping space not with family but with attendants. Servants lay nearby, ready to wake and fetch hot drinks or stoke the fire at their master's command. You might think that sounds pleasant, but would you really want people watching you snore? Privacy was rare at any level of society. Meanwhile, in the peasant cottage, privacy didn't exist either, but in a different way. Entire households, parents, children, sometimes even guests, shared a single bed or at least a single sleeping chamber. Bobbies cried, children kicked, someone coughed with fever. Every sound jostled your sleep. And if you thought you could sneak a midnight snack, well, the whole family would know. Still in the dark, when you're half asleep, hunger in your belly, smoke in your throat, something becomes clear. Rich or poor, lord or laborer, you're all just trying to make it through the same 16-hour night. You're all startled awake by strange noises, all haunted by the same wind rattling shutters, all imagining shapes in the shadows. The noble may dream of holding onto land and titles. The peasant may dream of having enough grain to last the winter. But when dawn finally spills gray light across the frost, both rise stiff, unrested, and grateful to have survived. Sleep is the one place where medieval Scotland's cruel winter nights cared nothing for status. The cold touched every skin, the dark invaded every chamber, and misery was generous enough to share itself among all classes. You stir awake in the middle of that long, heavy Scottish night, and what pulls you out of slumber isn't the cold this time, or the cough of someone sleeping nearby. It's the strange pulse of a dream. You lie there, eyes wide open in the dark, the images still clinging to your mind. An animal, a face, a sudden fall, perhaps the feeling of flying, and you don't shrug it off the way we do now. In medieval Scotland, dreams weren't just the clutter of the subconscious. They were omens, messages, warnings. Sometimes they were seen as whispers from God, sometimes as tricks of demons, and sometimes as glimpses into the future. Either way, you wouldn't dare laugh them off. Picture yourself waking from a nightmare of wolves tearing at your door. That might mean famine, or raiders, or even the death of someone in your family. Dream of a baby. That could predict new life or sorrow depending on who you asked. Even ordinary images carried weight. A dream of water could mean fortune if it was clear, danger if it was muddy. And you lying there in the black hours between first and second sleep would quietly replay the details, wondering if fate had just tapped you on the shoulder. Here's a historical fact. Medieval Scottish chronicles do record rulers and nobles placing weight on dreams. There are accounts of clan leaders delaying battles because of visions they claimed came during the night. One 15th century laird was said to have dreamed of a burning tower before his castle was raided and set alight. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some folks believed eating certain foods before bed could shape your dreams. Cheese, for instance, was thought to cause chaotic or even prophetic visions. So yes, long before the joke about weird dreams after too much pizza, there were Scots nervously chewing on their oatcakes and wondering if supper might invite a nightmare. Historians still argue whether ordinary peasants treated dream lore as seriously as elites did. Did farmers truly wake up and treat a dream of crows as an omen of crop failure? Or were such interpretations largely the fancy of monks, chroniclers, and literate nobles? The evidence is thin, but what's clear is that dreams carried cultural weight across every level of society. The danger, of course, was that fear of dreams could ripple outward. If you told your neighbors you dreamed of fire, they might whisper about witchcraft. If a local lord dreamed of betrayal, someone could be accused, imprisoned, or worse. Dreams didn't stay inside your head. They spilled into waking life, shaping choices, suspicions, and sometimes violence. And for you, lying there in your smoky box bed, the dream never truly fades. Maybe you whisper a prayer. Maybe you mutter to the protective charm hanging above your head. Maybe you simply close your eyes and try to slide back into second sleep, hoping this time the visions will be softer. Because in a land where 16 hours of night stretch across the winter, you'll dream again. And whether those dreams soothe or terrify, you'll never quite escape the feeling that they mean something. You're not sleeping soundly tonight, not with the noises all around you. The Scottish winter doesn't believe in silence. Instead, it gives you a soundtrack that seeps into your dreams and wakes you when you least expect it. Start with the wind. Your home, whether a stone cottage, a turf hut, or even a castle hall, is no fortress against the Scottish gales. Wind slips through cracks in the wood and stone, whistles through the keyhole, and moans like a restless spirit above the thatch. On nights like this, you might swear the house itself is alive, groaning, shifting, and breathing around you. It's little wonder that so many ghost tales begin with a night of howling winds. And then beyond the walls, you hear the wolves. Medieval Scotland had plenty of them, packs prowling the forests, sometimes bold enough to stalk close to villages when hunger drove them. Their howls cut through the dark like warnings. If you're unlucky, you hear them scrabbling near the edges of a croft, testing a door or sniffing at the livestock pens. You lie there, stiff and alert, clutching your blanket while imagining yellow eyes just beyond the firelight. Now add the owls. To you, maybe, an owl's call might be soothing, but to medieval Scots, that low, haunting cry carried bad luck. It was an omen of death. Some families kept charms specifically to ward off the ill fortune of hearing one too close to home. So when the bird shrieks into the blackness of the night, You shiver, wondering who in your household might be marked by fate. Here's a historical fact. Wolves were such a menace in medieval Scotland that bounties were paid for their pelts well into the 16th century. In fact, a royal decree once required certain tenants to take part in organized wolf hunts. Imagine having your night interrupted not only by the sound of wolves, but also by the thought that soon you'd be expected to help chase them down in the snow. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval people swore that you could predict weather by the way the wind howled at night. A whistling wind from the west, rain. A sharp shriek from the north, snow was coming. In a land where the weather was often cruel, listening closely to the night's music was almost a survival tactic. Historians still debate how much ordinary Scots really believed in these sound omens. Were the superstitions of owls and wolves truly widespread, or were they exaggerated in later folklore collections? Evidence is mixed, but when you're lying awake in the pitch-black, heart-hammering belief doesn't matter much. The fear is real enough. So you turn in your bed, pulling the covers up to your chin and try to drown out the chorus. The fire crackles low. The wind screams through a gap in the shutter. Wolves howl in the hills, and somewhere close by an owl calls once, twice, 3 times. You close your eyes and tell yourself it's only nature, but the part of you that grew up on stories isn't quite convinced. The night has dragged on so long you've begun to wonder if dawn even remembers you exist. 16 hours of darkness feels less like the turning of time and more like a punishment. Your candle is nothing but a stub now, the tallow dripping into a small pool at its base. You've been rationing it carefully, trying not to waste too much, but the wick still dies down with every faint breath of draft that slides through the cracks. So you sit there in the half-dark, watching that weak flame fight for its life, and every flicker feels like your own. Without it, you are plunged into pure, pressing blackness, nothing but the glow of embers in the hearth and the creak of beams in the roof. You strain your ears for any sign that the night is loosening its grip. A rooster crowing, a dog shifting restlessly, even the hush that comes just before dawn breaks. But nothing yet. Here's a fact. In medieval Scotland, time was often measured less by clocks and more by candles and natural sounds. Monasteries might ring bells to divide the hours, but in a farmhouse or croft, you counted time by how much wax you had left or how many logs burned down on the hearth. If the candle burned out before dawn, you simply sat in darkness, your own body the only clock that kept ticking. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some households used night candles, deliberately scored with notches, each mark meant to burn for an hour. They weren't precise, but they gave a sense of packing during the endless dark. Imagine carving marks into your one precious candle, then lying awake and staring at it, measuring your impatience in melting tallow. Historians still argue whether peasants in the far north of Scotland experienced more psychological stress from these elongated winter nights than those farther south. Was seasonal despair recognized at the time, or did people simply accept the crushing weight of darkness as another fact of life, no more remarkable than hunger or cold? The records don't say, but the human heart has always ached for the dawn. And so you wait. You keep glancing at the shutters at the edges of the window, hopping for the tiniest gray wash of morning. It comes so slowly that it feels almost cruel, First a faint paleness in the sky, then a dim silhouette of the hills, then finally the rooster calls. You exhale, shoulders loosening, but you know tomorrow the cycle begins again. 16 hours of darkness will return, and once again you'll sit hunched by the last candle, praying for time to move faster. For now, though, you savor that fragile hope. The day is short, bitter and hard, but at least the dark has lifted. For a few precious hours, you are free from its grip. Day, night, what difference does it really make anymore? The cycle is so lopsided in a Scottish winter that you stop counting. Your waking hours blur with your sleeping ones. You wake, you work, you wait for the dark, you huddle, you endure. Then the whole thing starts again. The brief daylight is hardly a blessing. The sun rises late, hangs low in the sky like a weak candle itself, and then slides away again before you can finish the tasks you desperately need done. You rush through the few hours of light, hauling water, tending animals, gathering wood, mending clothes, and still there's never enough time. The darkness always catches you. Here's a fact. Medieval Scottish life was profoundly seasonal. Winter dictated everything: diet, work, even social customs. Courts rarely met in midwinter and markets slowed to a crawl. It wasn't laziness, it was survival. When the nights were this long, you conserved energy and resources, waiting for the balance to return. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars think the long winter evenings were when oral storytelling truly thrived in Scotland. Folktales, riddles, and songs became more than entertainment. They were survival strategies, keeping minds occupied so that spirits wouldn't sink into despair. Imagine a whole community crowded around a single hearth, trading ghost stories while the wolves howled outside. Historians still debate how communities psychologically process this endless swing between fleeting daylight and endless night. Did they find comfort in ritual and tradition, or did the dark fray their nerves more than records suggest? The truth likely lies in between, a fragile balance of endurance, belief, and stubborn humor. And you living through it become part of that rhythm. Your life is measured in embers, in footsteps to the barn, in whispered stories told in the dark. Winter is not just a season here. It is a test of patience, faith, and sheer willpower. And it comes back every year without fail. But now, as we close our journey tonight, you can let go of that tension. You don't have to strain your ears for wolves, or watch a candle melt notch by notch, or shiver under thin wool waiting for dawn. That was their burden, not yours. Instead, imagine the fire burning steadily, its light no longer fading but holding, warm and golden, casting soft shadows on the stone walls. Picture yourself stretched out beside it. No rush, no fear, no chores waiting in the morning. Outside, the wind has softened to nothing more than a faint whisper, a lullaby rather than a threat. The endless cycle of day and night has slowed. It no longer presses down on you, demanding your strength. The darkness has become something gentle, wrapping you not in fear but in calm. And if you listen closely, there are no owls crying, no wolves prowling, no timbers groaning. Just the steady hum of a world at peace. The hearth glows, your body relaxes, your breath deepens. Remember, every night, no matter how long, eventually yields to light. For you, dawn is not 16 hours away. It is just the next moment when you open your eyes, rested. So let the embers blur, let the shadows soften, and let yourself drift. A sweet dreams.